The night sky over Europe in 1943 was no longer dark. Searchlights clawed at the heavens, anti-aircraft fire turned silence into storms of steel, and German radar swept invisible beams across the black, hunting for the bombers that carried the war into the heart of the Reich. Crews inside those bombers felt the net closing every time they crossed the channel. Engines drummed, flak burst in clouds around them, and the eerie green glow of radar screens inside Luftwaffe control rooms meant death could be plotted with mathematical precision. Hollywood often paints these missions as daring, almost noble raids through danger, with bombers flying steady formations until their payloads fall in perfect sequence. But the truth was harsher. Men died by the thousands, torn apart by shrapnel, trapped in burning wrecks that tumbled from the sky. Every flight was a gamble, and the odds were turning worse as German radar locked onto their approach with uncanny accuracy. And then came a secret mission, a plan whispered in back rooms and tested in silence, that would flip the odds. It was not brute force or sheer courage, but deception. The Allies would learn to blind the German radar, to jam its signals and shatter its grip. It was the birth of electronic warfare, and it would change the skies forever. If you want to uncover this hidden chapter of the air war, the mission that turned science into a weapon and made machines lie, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and join us on this journey into the shadows, where silence and static became as deadly as bombs. The bombers left their bases in England at dusk, their engines a low thunder rolling over sleeping villages. They formed up in long streams, climbing into the night, their silhouettes merging into the darkness above the channel. For the men inside, the hours ahead were a march into fear. They carried bombs meant to crush German industry, but every mission carried the weight of dreadful odds. Half of them knew they might never return. At first, there was silence. The only sound was the steady drone of engines and the occasional crackle of the intercom. Crews lit cigarettes, checked instruments, and stared into the black void outside their narrow windows. It almost felt peaceful, like flying through a sea of stars. But beneath that calm was the knowledge that somewhere, beyond the coastline they could not yet see, German radar was already at work. Invisible beams swept the sky, bouncing off their formations, painting them as bright marks on green screens in darkened rooms hundreds of miles away. The hunt had begun long before the crews even sensed danger. In those rooms, Luftwaffe operators leaned over glowing scopes, their headphones filled with static and blips of sound. To them, the bombers were not men in machines, but moving dots, tracked with ruthless precision. They passed coordinates to controllers who vectored night fighters into position. Pilots of Bf-110s and Ju-88s climbed into the darkness, their own radars guiding them toward unsuspecting prey. It was a chess match played in silence, with lives traded for every move. The crews knew when the net began to close. The first sign was the searchlights. Powerful beams clawed upward, sweeping across the sky like the fingers of a giant hand. Once a bomber was caught in that blinding glare, others locked on, weaving a cage of light. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, their shells bursting in black clouds lit with sparks. The air shook. Fragments tore through fuselages, and men clung to their controls, while the world outside became a storm of fire. Then came the night fighters. Silent, unseen, they slid into position behind or beneath the bombers. Sometimes the crew never saw them at all until tracers stitched across the wings, fuel tanks erupted, and the aircraft became a fireball plunging into the fields below. Survivors told of hearing only the sudden rattle of cannon fire, the tearing of metal, the screams of their own friends, and then nothing. For every bomber that reached its target, another was falling, torn apart by enemies guided to them by radar. The fear was not just of death, but of helplessness. A man could fight another man, see his enemy, aim a gun, take a chance. But how could he fight an invisible beam? How could he aim at a signal or dodge something he could not even see? The bombers flew on, mile after mile, knowing they were hunted by an enemy who watched them from afar. Each minute stretched into an hour, each flak burst hammered their nerves, each sudden flash of light in the distance marked another crew gone forever. Losses mounted in staggering numbers. Whole squadrons vanished in a single raid. Families in England waited for news that never came. The men who returned spoke of night skies alive with fire, of comrades screaming as they fell, of machines breaking apart and falling into the Black Sea. And always, behind it all, was the same invisible hand guiding the destruction: German radar. It turned the vast night sky into a killing ground, where the hunters always knew where to find their prey. For the Allies, this invisible enemy was unbearable. Courage alone could not defeat it. The crews were brave, yes, but bravery could not blind radar screens or silence the voices directing night fighters to their targets. The war in the air was becoming less about bombs and bullets and more about waves, signals, and deception. Somewhere, somehow, a way had to be found to fight the unseen. The stage was set for a new kind of war, one fought not only with steel and fire, but with science. A war where victory might depend not on how fast a plane could climb or how thick its armor was, but on whether a machine could trick another machine into seeing ghosts. Out of the despair of the bomber losses, the search began for a weapon, as strange as it was revolutionary: radar jamming. In London, far from the thunder of flak and the glow of burning bombers, another war was being fought. It was quiet, fought not with rifles or tanks, but with pencils, chalkboards, and machines wired together on cluttered workbenches. Scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers gathered in dim rooms and secret laboratories, driven by the same urgency as the men flying through night skies. They knew radar was killing the bomber force faster than bombs could ever cripple German industry. If something wasn't done, the entire campaign of strategic bombing could collapse. From the start, it was clear that brute force would not solve the problem. No armor was thick enough. No guns were large enough to protect bombers from an enemy that found them before they could fight back. The answer had to be different. A weapon that targeted not the planes in the air, but the invisible beams that guided the enemy's hand. The British had been early pioneers of radar themselves, and now that knowledge turned to defense. If radar could reveal, perhaps it could also be deceived. The first ideas were simple. What if the beams could be cluttered with false echoes? Scientists tested strips of aluminum foil, cut to just the right length to reflect radar waves, dropped in bundles from bombers. These strips, codenamed Window, created clouds of reflections that blinded German screens, filling them with phantom aircraft. Radar operators watching their scopes suddenly saw hundreds of dots, where only a handful of bombers existed. To their eyes, the sky became a storm of ghosts, but deception alone was not enough. The Germans could learn to ignore the clutter, to filter signals, to adjust their equipment. What was needed was a way to not just confuse, but to overwhelm, to pour so much noise into the enemy's system that it could no longer see anything at all. That meant building devices that could listen to German radar frequencies, then broadcast back signals strong enough to drown them in static. It was a new kind of weapon, one that carried no bullets and dropped no bombs, but could be just as lethal. The work was dangerous in its own way. Every time scientists tested a jammer, they risked revealing to the enemy that such technology existed. If the Germans realized too soon, they would change their radar frequencies, adapt their defenses, and the window of opportunity would be lost. For months, the research continued in silence. Devices hidden inside boxes no bigger than suitcases, wires soldered by hand, tested on lonely airfields under the cover of night. Bomber Command was skeptical at first. Air marshals and hardened officers had spent years thinking in terms of formations, bombs, and armor. Could a handful of scientists really change the course of the air war with strips of foil and buzzing boxes? But the losses in the skies gave them little choice. Every month, hundreds of bombers were being torn apart. If these strange inventions offered even a slim chance of survival, they had to be tried, and so the plans moved from theory to mission. Devices were loaded aboard bombers, tucked beneath radio sets or bolted into fuselages. Crews were briefed in whispers, told not just how to use them, but how secret they were. If captured, they were to reveal nothing. The enemy could never know too soon that his all-seeing eye might be blinded. It was science turned to war, mathematics and physics woven into survival. What had once been chalk on blackboards was now steel in bomb bays, buzzing transmitters strapped into the heart of aircraft. The gamble was immense. If it worked, radar jamming could save thousands of lives, tilt the balance of the bombing campaign, and cripple Germany's ability to defend itself. If it failed, more men would burn in the skies, and the scientists' promises would vanish in smoke. The stage was set for the first true test. The bombers would not only carry destruction in their bays, they would carry deception in their wiring. The Germans would not face only steel and fire, but silence and ghosts. The invisible enemy had ruled the night for too long, and now, for the first time, the Allies would try to strike back in kind. The night chosen for the test was moonless, the kind of black sky where even the stars seemed muted. At the English airfields, ground crews worked in silence, checking engines, arming bombs, and loading strange new equipment into the bellies of bombers. To most of the men climbing aboard, it looked like just another raid, another night into hell. But tucked among the bombs and fuel tanks were devices that hummed with quiet purpose. They were the Allies' first true radar jammers, and tonight would decide whether they were miracle or myth. Engines roared to life, and once again the great stream of bombers climbed into the night. For the first hour, nothing felt different. The crews smoked, adjusted dials, and settled in for the long journey east. But as they crossed the channel, radio operators flipped switches on the new boxes. Antennas hidden beneath fuselages sparked to life, filling the air with static that human ears could not hear. Invisible waves of noise spread outward, colliding with the beams of German radar. In control rooms across occupied Europe, Luftwaffe operators leaned over their glowing scopes. At first, everything seemed normal, the faint echoes of bombers rising in steady patterns. But then suddenly the dots scattered. Where a moment ago the screens had shown neat tracks of aircraft, now they swarmed with confusion. Blips multiplied, flickered, vanished, reappeared in strange places. Some operators reported entire squadrons where none existed. Others swore the bombers had vanished entirely. Commands were barked, recalculations made, fighters scrambled into the void, but already the rhythm of defense was breaking apart. For the bomber crews, the difference was not subtle. They had grown used to the routine of terror. The searchlights snapping on, the flak beginning in precise barrages, the sudden appearance of night fighters guided straight to their positions. Tonight was different. Searchlights probed blindly, sweeping the sky in frantic arcs but catching nothing. Black batteries opened fire too late, their shells bursting in empty air. The night fighters circled, hunting, but many never even found their prey. Crews inside the bombers realized slowly with disbelief that the net was failing. The invisible hand that had hunted them for so long was faltering. Some veterans later described the feeling as surreal. They flew into Germany expecting death, yet the sky was strangely quiet. Flak was inaccurate, night fighters rare. A mission that should have claimed dozens of lives passed, with losses counted in single digits. Crews reached their targets, dropped their bombs, and turned for home with engines still intact, wings unscarred. For the first time in years, men returned to their airfields and saw entire squadrons landing together instead of scattered fragments limping back or missing entirely. In Germany, the shock was immediate. Radar operators reported failures, confusion, and what some called sabotage. Commanders demanded explanations. How could hundreds of bombers cross the Reich with so little resistance? How had the searchlights and night fighters been blinded? For the first time since the Blitz, it was the defenders who felt helpless, staring at screens that no longer told the truth. The mission proved what scientists had promised, but few had believed, that machines could lie. Radar, once the sharpest eye of the Reich, could be blinded, confused, even mocked. And with that revelation, the entire balance of the air war shifted. No longer would the bombers march unchallenged into slaughter. They carried with them now an invisible shield, one made not of steel, but of static. For the men who lived it, the memory was unforgettable. Some spoke of it with awe, calling it the night the skies changed. Others remembered the eerie quiet, how strange it felt to fly, without the usual storm of fire around them. One radio operator recalled staring at the humming box at his side, realizing that this simple device had saved more lives in an hour than months of armor and gunnery drills had managed. The secret mission had succeeded. But victory in war is never final. The Germans would adapt, change their frequencies, harden their defenses, and the Allies would have to adapt again, building newer, stronger jammers, turning science into a race as deadly as any duel between planes. The battle for the skies was no longer just about speed or firepower. It was about who could control the invisible world of signals, and who could stay ahead in a war fought not only in steel, but in silence. The first missions with radar jamming stunned the Luftwaffe, but shock quickly turned into resolve. Germany had not built an empire of defenses only to surrender to static and foil. Within days of the bombers' mysterious success, scientists and engineers were summoned, ordered to uncover why their screens had betrayed them. Operators described phantom planes, cluttered echoes, and the strange blankness that swallowed real tracks. The Reich's high command demanded answers. And so began a new battle, not of tanks clashing or cities burning, but of frequencies, filters, and deception. German scientists pored over captured fragments of aluminum strips dropped from Allied bombers. They measured them, cut them, and realized what had been done. The window tactic, as the Allies called it, was ingenious in its simplicity. Each strip was tuned to the exact length that reflected German radar waves, creating hundreds of ghost targets. In response, the Luftwaffe altered their radar filters, searching for ways to sift truth from lies. They experimented with different wavelengths, wider scanning bands, and new forms of plotting. For a time, it worked. Their scopes grew clearer, their night fighters began to find prey again, and the terror for bomber crews crept back into the skies. But even as the Germans countered, the Allies pushed forward. The jammers that once simply blasted noise grew more sophisticated. Engineers learned not only to drown radar with static, but to mimic signals, to create false blips that danced across screens as if entire squadrons of bombers were approaching from directions where none existed. Operators scrambled fighters into empty skies, chasing illusions, while the real bomber streams slipped past, pounding factories and rail lines in the Ruhr. This invisible duel became a mirror war. For every new German radar, the Allies built a jammer tuned precisely to its frequency. For every filter that tried to sift out window, new techniques scattered strips in ways harder to ignore. British and American scientists worked in secrecy, their laboratories guarded as closely as any weapons factory, because the weapons they built could not be photographed or paraded. Their power existed only in the silence of a blinded screen or the chaos of a false echo. Bomber crews felt the results directly. Some nights the defenses were fierce, flak bursting in deadly rings, fighters cutting through formations. Other nights, under the protection of perfected jamming, the sky felt strangely open, as if they had stolen invisibility for a few precious hours. Crews whispered about it like a charm, a shield woven of noise and deception. Yet they also knew it was temporary. The Germans adapted too quickly, their radar net too vast to stay blinded for long. In Berlin, generals fumed at the betrayal of their once reliable systems. The Luftwaffe's night fighter arm, already stretched thin, struggled to adapt to the sudden blindness. Some commanders accused operators of incompetence, others feared sabotage. In truth, the problem was deeper. The Allies had moved the battlefield into a realm the Germans had not prepared to defend. They had turned the very airwaves into a weapon, and the Reich was forced to race just to keep up. As the contest deepened, the skies grew more unpredictable. On some missions, crews would fly through entire raids barely touched, marveling at the jammers' effectiveness. On others, the Germans clawed back control, unveiling new radars with sharper resolution, new fighters with upward-firing cannons that bypassed the chaos on the ground. Every adaptation forced another counter, every counter sparked another invention. It was a duel that never ended, fought not just in the skies, but in the hidden halls of laboratories and workshops, where men with pencils and oscilloscopes waged war just as surely as those with bombs and rifles. The Allies' advantage lay not just in the devices themselves, but in their willingness to gamble. They risked using untested technology in live combat, knowing that the first use might expose their secrets. They relied on courage, not only of crews, but of scientists who believed their strange machines could alter the course of battles. The Germans, slower to experiment, found themselves reacting rather than dictating. For every shadow they cast, the Allies raised another counter-shadow. By 1944, the skies over Europe were filled not only with steel and fire, but with an invisible storm of signals, echoes, and lies. Bombers no longer faced only flak and fighters. They flew inside a battlefield where deception was as real as armor. The men who fought there would later say the most terrifying enemy was the one they never saw, the unseen hand of radar, always searching. And the greatest relief was when that hand faltered, when the jammer's hum meant that, at least for a night, they had slipped through the net. The invisible war had reached its peak. Yet as D-Day approached and the Allies prepared the greatest invasion in history, radar jamming would be called upon not just to protect bombers, but to shield an entire armada. What had begun as a secret mission to blind German night fighters would soon decide whether the beaches of Normandy could be reached at all. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe was no longer just a contest of steel against steel. It had become a duel of minds, of scientists and strategists who bent invisible forces into weapons. And as the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the lessons of radar jamming were no longer a side experiment. They were central to whether the greatest gamble of the war could succeed. The Germans had poured concrete and steel into the Atlantic Wall. Gun emplacements bristled along the coast. Mines littered the beaches, and behind it all, radar sites dotted the coastline from Denmark to Brittany, tall masts that swept the skies with invisible eyes. These stations gave the Reich precious time, warning of incoming raids or convoys, tracking the movements of fleets before they reached shore. If those radars saw the invasion fleet too early, the Germans could rush reinforcements, tighten defenses, and make the beaches impassable. The answer was not to destroy every radar, an impossible task, but to blind them, to drown their signals in lies. In the weeks leading up to June 6th, the Allies unleashed one of the most ambitious deception campaigns in history. Ghost armies of inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic fooled German intelligence into expecting landings in Calais. At the same time, radar jamming aircraft prepared to create phantom fleets on German scopes. As the invasion fleet moved toward Normandy, special squadrons flew parallel courses, dropping endless streams of window, those same strips of foil perfected months earlier. On radar screens across France, operators stared in confusion. Instead of one fleet, they saw two, one heading for Calais, another toward Normandy. The deception held long enough to split the German response, scattering their strength when every moment counted. For the men storming the beaches, the value of radar jamming was invisible, but vital. Every extra hour of confusion bought them space to land, to dig in, to push inland before German reserves could arrive in force. Veterans of the invasion later spoke of the sheer chaos, the smoke, the fire, the bodies on the sand. Few of them thought about radar beams sweeping the skies behind the scenes. Yet without that invisible protection, the weight of the Reich might have come crashing down on them before they had even left the surf. From that moment on, Radar jamming was no longer an experiment, but a cornerstone of modern war. As bombers thundered deeper into Germany, they carried not just bombs, but the quiet hum of deception in their bellies. As fleets sailed across the Channel, they relied not only on armor and guns, but on the storm of false signals that cloaked their approach. The invisible war had become inseparable from the visible one, but victory bred legacy. When the war ended in 1945, the tanks and planes of the battlefield became museum pieces or scrap metal. The devices that had blinded radar did not. They were studied, refined, and quietly woven into the foundations of every military doctrine that followed. The Cold War dawned in shadows, and once again bombers became the centerpiece of strategy, this time not to drop conventional bombs, but nuclear ones. To reach their targets through Soviet defenses, they would need more than speed. They would need to slip past radars that stretched across continents. And so the work of those scientists in dim laboratories, soldering wires and cutting foil, lived on in the wings of B-52s and the hulls of submarines that carried missiles beneath the Arctic ice. Even today, the hum of radar jamming still echoes. Modern stealth fighters glide through the air not only by shaping their bodies to deflect beams, but by carrying devices that can confuse, disrupt, or silence enemy sensors. Warships at sea bristle with electronic suites designed to blind incoming missiles before they strike. Satellites in orbit whisper signals meant to deceive others that sweep the heavens below. The battlefield is no longer just earth, sea, and air. It is electromagnetic, invisible yet decisive, and yet for decades, the story of how it began remained hidden. Pilots who flew those first missions rarely spoke about the black boxes beside them. Scientists who soldered wires in secrecy never saw their names etched in medals or monuments. The glory went to the visible heroes, the tank crews at Kursk, the Marines on Iwo Jima, the generals who commanded armies. The invisible war lived in silence, overshadowed by fire and steel. But history is not only the story of what is seen. It is also the story of what is felt, what is whispered, what is hidden beneath the surface. And the men who survived those missions knew the truth. They knew that when the searchlights failed to find them, when the flak burst in empty air, when the night fighters circled aimlessly, it was not luck alone. It was science turned into shadow. It was deception, wielded like a blade. The legacy of radar jamming is not just in machines, it is in the philosophy it created, that war is not only about strength, but about perception, about who sees and who is seen. In that sense, those first missions did more than save lives. They rewrote the rules of combat. From Normandy to the deserts of the Middle East, from the jungles of Vietnam to the contested skies of today, every time a soldier trusts that the enemy cannot see him, he walks in the footsteps of that secret mission. And so, the story circles back to the crews who took off into the black sky in 1943, unaware of whether the strange boxes beside them would work or fail. They were pioneers in a new kind of war, one fought in silence, where the difference between life and death could be measured in static. Theirs was not a clean fight. Not the heroic dogfights Hollywood would later script. It was confusion, deception, and fear. But it worked, and in working it changed history. The skies of Europe are quiet now. The radars are silent, their beams long since switched off. But if you listen closely, if you stand on one of those old airfields where grass grows through cracked runways, you can almost hear it, the low hum of a black box hidden inside a bomber. The sound of static filling the night, the moment when science blinded death itself. That sound was the birth of the invisible war, and its echoes have never left us.